So after those brief presentations, I feel like I have all the time in the world, but I know that lunch is next, so that I need to keep it brief. I'll add my thanks to Borshka and other members of the Planning Committee for the opportunity. As you'll see in my next slide, I spend a fair amount of my time driving around not only the Los Angeles area, but flying around the country and sometimes internationally as well, trying to promote more interest in activity and implementation science. So my personal professional mission, I think, is nicely aligned with the mission and goal of this, this activity. And my assignment, as you've seen from the title, is to talk a little bit about what we do have underway within the region and opportunities for you to become involved. So I think the middle point, strengthening the quantity and quality of implementation science and practice, is really what we're here for, and again, what I try to devote part of my career to. And the bottom point, I think, is the reason. I think it's fair to say that we need more and better implementation. We have a plethora of evidence-based effective practices that we know we're not using fully and properly. And the argument that we make as implementation scientists that we hope is valid is that in order to see more and better implementation, we need more and better implementation science. So my tour of the regional activities will begin with what we view as the granddaddy or grandmom of them all, and that is our annual Southern California Dissemination, Implementation, Improvement Science Symposium. That's an event that this year will take place at the end of June. This is, I believe, either our 4th or 5th year of the activity. It was initiated by the CTSI at UCLA along with USC, but we very quickly involved other Los Angeles area partners as well as UC San Diego. So Greg, Harold, and others have been with us from the outset. There's also a webinar series that's conducted by our initiative, and there are a number of campus-specific activities that are linked in some way. So for those of you who are not familiar with, aware of, and not planning to attend the meeting in June, I would encourage you to grab one of the spots while they're still available. One of the other, if not the other major activity within the region, and by far the activity with the longest tenure, is the VA Health Service Research and Development Service, and more recently, and I say that because it's 20 years old, whereas HSR&D is 30 years old, more recently Query, the Quality Enhancement Research Initiative. Most of the activity, most of the funding is based in Los Angeles at the VA. Allison Hamilton, I believe now, has the title of Associate Director, Lead for Implementation Science for the HSR&D Center at the VA in Los Angeles. I retain a small affiliation with that VA, but I'm primarily at Kaiser these days. We've had ongoing collaborations with HSR&D and query investigators in San Diego, and of course, as Borshka has indicated, there are ties to some of the other query centers around the country as well, and HSR&D centers. There are a number of central resources on the HSR&D and query websites. We don't quite have the annual meetings that we used to have that allowed us to interact and collaborate more intensively. But again, a good place to go to get plugged in essentially to the implementation science community within the Southern California area. Within Los Angeles, and I know it's true here as well, most of us have at least 2 or 3 affiliations. So all of the VA investigators have a RAND and or UCLA affiliation as well. So again, a very tight network and a major focus center of activity within the VA centers. Each of the CTSAs in our region has implementation science activity. We're not doing quite as well as our counterparts up at UC San Francisco or others that I've listed on the slide as far as having a D&I core, but there is investment in, interest in, and support for dissemination implementation science activity within the UCLA CTSI, as well as USC, UCI as well, and of course UC San Diego. This may not be a complete list, but I think among the campuses of the CTSAs that are most actively invested in implementation science is these that I've listed on the slide. UC San Francisco that has certificate programs and degree programs. UNC Chapel Hill has a very rich website with lots of good resources. Washington University, St. Louis as well. University of Colorado, Denver, the CTSI. Within UCLA, we have a number of other initiatives, though, and I'm sure there are counterparts here as well, where we find implementation and improvement science activity, even though it's not necessarily linked to the CTSI. So I think the key point is to not focus all of your efforts at seeking out colleagues and related activity, not focus only on the CTSI or CTSA, but look more broadly as well. Our clinical scholars or clinician scholars program at UCLA for a number of years has had active emphasis on improvement science activity, VA NERSA fellowship programs as well. At USC, the Gare Family Center for Health System Science, which was originally named the Gare Family Center for Implementation Science, is one of a small number of focused centers on university campuses, primarily within medical schools, that are focused on implementation science. And there's, again, a small list of others elsewhere around the country. Within USC, the School of Social Work, Larry Palinkas and others have interest in activity and implementation science in the School of Engineering as well. So again, I'm sure that on this campus, you could find pockets of related expertise and activity, perhaps not labeled implementation science, but labeled by one of the many other terms in the Tower of Babel, but find like-minded colleagues who are pursuing the same kinds of questions using comparable methods. UC Irvine, Miriam Bender I'll mention because she's working hard as a new faculty member to stimulate and expand implementation science activity on the campus at UC Irvine. This is a partial list of some of the other institutions and places within Southern California where you can find implementation science activity. UC Riverside, it's had a small amount. Some limited interest, relatively new at Cal State University Long Beach. I know San Diego State as well has activity. I'm now affiliated with what we call our Care Improvement Research Team. It's a division of the Kaiser Southern California Department of Research and Evaluation. Most of you may know that each of the Kaiser regions has a research center. Lots of epidemiology at our center in Southern California, but about 6-7 years ago, we received a commitment of funding from the health plan to set up an internal HSR implementation science program with the requirement that we devote our activities, our energy and attention to health system problems. So in some ways, it's very much a replica of the Query, which was a similar investment of clinical dollars in research with the requirement that that research pursue health system improvement and science at the same time. And that's actually the reason why I'm at Kaiser. They made a decision to borrow and steal rather than reinvent the wheel. So my role was to help Kaiser emulate Query and use some of the lessons that we had learned over our 15 or 20 years at the time of experience trying to conduct partnership-oriented research in a way that met the needs and expectations of the practice leaders and those of the scientists, which, as you all know, is not necessarily an easy thing to do. The Los Angeles County Department of Health Services has been quite active over the last 5 to 10 years in hiring graduating clinical scholars, fellows from UCLA, because of a new orientation on innovation, stimulated primarily by the Affordable Care Act and new opportunities and needs for competition and innovation. So we now consider DHS to be a partner with us with a fair amount of academically oriented, grant-funded research as part of their public sector safety and health system. Ultimed is, I believe, the largest federally qualified health center in the country, based in the Los Angeles area. It is establishing an Institute for Health Equity. The mission statement talks about equity, although when you hear the key leaders at Ultimed describe it, what they are describing is a learning health system kind of model. They would like to establish research activity within their health system that, as is the case with Kaiser and VA, attempts to simultaneously strengthen and improve health system performance and contribute scientific generalizable knowledge. So it's, we hope, is a model for the rest of the country and other larger FQHCs to emulate Ultimed and in some ways Kaiser and VA and establish these kinds of internal programs. Some other institutions that I've listed here, including at the bottom, 2 of the major community institutions that have partnered with UCLA for years and in some cases decades. Picori talks about community engaged and stakeholder engaged, patient engaged research. We talk about community-based participatory research. It's now quite popular in the States, and we all know that this is the way that we should be doing research. UCLA, Ken Wells, Loretta Jones, and others have been doing this since most of us were still in grad school or before. So there's a very long history and a tradition and culture of very close community agency research academic partnerships within Los Angeles that I think serve as a useful model. The next 3 slides Borshka provided, although I made some modifications to the graphics, as you'll see. But these are some of the local campus resources. Seminar series with contact information at the bottom at CARSIC that Greg directs. And these slides I know will be available for you afterwards. A course that they teach, this is one of my modifications. So when I was looking in Google Images to find a photo, a model Tesla came up. I now realize it's not yours. This is a Model S, but somehow Google Images has a Tesla attached to your own name. In any event, this is the course. So, sure, that's true. Yeah, some of us would like the company to make sure that it remains in business. If you haven't seen Greg's car, you need to go take a look at it, and then he and I can exchange pictures and stories. The course is what I should be talking about, so another key resource on campus. In this case, I think you're a bit ahead of us because UCLA has been talking for quite some time about the establishment of an implementation improvement science focus within our School of Public Health doctoral program, and we're only slowly getting there. And then the final slide of local resources, and I know there's some others later on in the day and some additional resources in the packets, the handouts for local resources, but pilot grants from the your CTSA as well as a writing group. Greg knows very well the scheme and the portfolio of activities at Washington University St. Louis that includes these kind and then some. So I think all of us, we're looking to try to broaden and expand our activity. But for those of you somewhat new to the field, here are the local resources that you can begin to explore. This slide is a little bit separate from the others, but I think as you begin to think about implementation science in the ways that you can contribute, these are some of the core building blocks or elements of the field of implementation science. There is active work and a need for more work in each of these different domains. We're still thinking about what is the mission and scope, what are the aims of our field. We're still thinking about conceptual and theoretical frameworks, not developing more, but trying to understand how to use them and synthesize them. I'll talk a little bit about research approaches, designs, and methods, and then, of course, more efforts to expand the number of settings and sites, to develop databases. We talked earlier this week at a VA advisory meeting about the need for a VA organizational characteristics database. VA has a number of registries and other databases, but those of us who do implementation studies and would like to do large-scale, large-sample observational studies need established databases that describe organizational size and complexity and culture and geographic locations and a number of other factors. These are the kinds of data resources that we need to continue to contribute to develop in order to facilitate our work. So let me talk a little bit about the types of studies and designs that I would argue are needed. And my conflict of interest disclosure here is the fact that much of this relates directly to a set of PCORI method standards that we hope will be approved and released next week that provide guidance for studying complex interventions. And I'll contrast two different types of studies and talk about which we need more of within implementation science. The first is the distinction between experimental work, where we tend to, as investigators, come to health system leaders to say, we have a great idea for an implementation project, which we guarantee will improve quality and outcomes. It may not necessarily be in the kind of clinical domain that you're interested in, but trust us, it's something you should be interested in. As we know, grant reviewers and we as researchers often like to focus on internal validity. As Russ and Larry Green and others have pointed out, external validity is important. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about observational studies and the benefits that they offer and why we need more of them. But I'd also like to focus on the distinction between impact-oriented effectiveness studies versus more process and mechanism-oriented studies. So when we do succeed in achieving successful implementation in experimental work within VA, Kaiser, and our RCTs, and we think about what it was that contributed to the success, oftentimes it's a set of factors that are not sustainable and not very realistic. When we, as researchers, approach leaders, again, we often manage to convince them to sign a letter of support that we wrote, expressing their commitment and enthusiasm. But we know that that letter, even if they remember it a year and a half later when the study is funding, even if the same leaders are in place, they're likely to have different priorities. So there are clear dangers in approaching leaders with our priorities. We also know that the rest of the organization, even if the leader is committed and does agree with us that this is a priority, the rest of the organization is not necessarily focused on that domain of care and that improvement. And then, what's one of the more interesting limitations of these kinds of studies is that we will often interview clinicians and nurses and other staff about, how they view the evidence-based practice that we're implementing in the implementation project. And then we will often conduct participant observation or interview patients. And there's this mindset that the clinicians will abide by the study protocol, follow the study protocol, because they're accustomed to research and they know they need to as part of research. Those are not routine, realistic, externally valid kinds of conditions. Investigators who conduct clinical trials and manage to convince physicians and staff to follow the trial protocol, oftentimes with some financial incentives or study nurses, do so in order to maintain or achieve the highest level of fidelity. For us, achieving artificial fidelity is in some ways damaging the study more than it's supporting it, because the implementation success that we see under those circumstances is not at all representative of the implementation success that we would see under normal circumstances. There's some other limitations and challenges or flaws in efficacy-oriented, researcher-funded, researcher-led implementation efforts that I've listed on this slide. When we bring grant funds to the sites, when we bring funding to hire new staff, or to provide supervision, when we as researchers are on site helping them with the implementation or improvement process, collecting data by conducting surveys and watching them, and generating Hawthorne effects again, we're essentially stacking the deck in favor of a finding of successful implementation and practice change with very little or no generalizability and external validity. So, again, a number of reasons why investigator-initiated, investigator-led, efficacy-oriented implementation studies are probably not the best way for us to try to generate insights. This is a pipeline diagram from another talk, but it basically points out that implementation studies and implementation insights can be developed not only through investigator-led interventional implementation work, but also, especially in systems like Kaiser and VA and UCSD Health and others that are implementing new programs all the time. We can insert ourselves quietly and hopefully without too much of an intervention effect to understand the implementation processes and the barriers and facilitators. So if we could convince reviewers to downplay the threats to internal validity of observational studies, and if we could convince ourselves as investigators that observational work is actually more valuable than interventional work, oftentimes in implementation, I think the field would do better. So some good opportunities here for innovative studies. Here's some of the other advantages of conducting observational studies. Again, stimulated and inspired in part by what we have within VA with 150 medical centers and 1,000 clinics that allow us to study the adaptations and see the variations and examine the influence of organizational leadership and culture and staff training and all of the other long list of covariates that we know influence implementation outcomes but can't be analyzed quantitatively in a 20-site RCT. They can be examined quantitatively in a 150 and certainly in a 1,000-site observational study. So just a final couple of slides on the other point in terms of differences between the kind of research that we often do and what we as a good clinical trialist were trained to do in the research that we should be doing. For the most part, when we think about research that is meant to guide and support decision makers' questions, and if we're thinking about clinical trials, we think about FDA decisions or P&T committee decisions. Our goal as researchers is to answer the question, is innovative treatment X effective? Or for comparative effectiveness research, is A better than B? Even individual physicians would like to know if a drug is effective. So we have this concept of effectiveness with a capital E and these yes-no questions. The answer is either yes it is or no it's not. RCTs and other kinds of study designs that we like to do are optimized in order to answer those kinds of questions. And that's why we all view the RCT as the gold standard. The dilemma that we face as researchers who are evaluating complex interventions, that as we were discussing in the morning, are adaptable. They can be adapted, they will be adapted, irrespective of our efforts as researchers to try to promote fidelity. And oftentimes they should be adapted because adaptation leads to better outcomes, although they shouldn't be adapted randomly. They should be adapted in a way that follows guidance that we as researchers generate. For some drugs, you can get a clear yes-no answer. There are so-called magic bullets where the effects are so strong that and we don't know how to personalize our prescribing. So we go ahead and say, everybody should take these, even if we only know that 10 or 20% of patients would benefit. With complex interventions, we have the ability to adapt the formulation of the intervention in a way that's not possible for drugs. With a drug, you either prescribe it or you don't. You don't modify the chemical formulation. If we can adapt our complex interventions, and we should be adapting them because we know we can maximize effectiveness, our job as researchers in studying complex interventions like implementation strategies is not to answer the yes-no question. There is no formulary list of effective implementation strategies that we can draw from. The answer to the question, is implementation strategy A effective, is almost always, it depends. That itself is not a good answer. We need to know what it depends on. So that's the kind of research that we should be doing. There might be some highly robust complex interventions where we can basically deploy them as if they were 5-cent pills and assume that enough sites will benefit. On the other hand, the costs of that deployment are high enough that even that's not a good strategy. It's quite possible that that we have an illusion of highly robust complex interventions. They just don't exist. That everything has highly heterogeneous effects, and we should be focusing more on how these interventions achieve their impacts rather than trying to answer the question if they do. And I'm happy to talk about that further, and I would encourage all of you to watch for the PCORI method standards for complex interventions. So let me wrap up with just a couple of slides. There are, I think, opportunities for us to conduct implementation studies within our regions, especially for areas that allow us to and even require multi-system collaborations, multi-level interventions, interventions for which we need community-focused activity as well as health system and patient-focused activity. Be There San Diego is one example that you could look to for some guidance. A number of years ago, Barbara Vickery and I had conducted a trial of Alzheimer's disease care management strategies that involved most of the health systems and 3 relevant community agencies. So there is a history of these kinds of cross-institution, cross-agency collaborations. Healthy LA is a concept that we've talked about for a number of years and haven't yet found the staff and the funding to move it forward, but it's basically the idea that we need to develop collaborations between the health systems, the schools, the churches, the YMCAs, the various after-school programs, that for physical activity in particular, any single level, single institution effort is essentially too little too late. HPV vaccination is another example. Unless we have community level health promotion strategies that are coordinated with and synergistic with the health system focused and physician led and directed interventions, we're not likely to see much effect. This is a case where often 2 + 2 + 2 = 0 if they're uncoordinated. But if they are coordinated, then we get a sum of 10 or 20. So we need all of the elements in place at the same time from the regional community level down to the level of the individual physician-patient interaction. Final thoughts, some potential next steps in order to, again, grow the quantity and the quality of implementation science. I think beginning with an effort to identify the pockets of activity, looking within the education school, sociology, psychology, economics, all the different areas where we know implementation science activity might be going on, and identifying like-minded researchers is a critical first step. Trying to develop the collaborations and partnerships with the local policy and practice leaders, developing your practice-based research networks, working with UCSD Health, to establish an ongoing partnership so that you have that living learning lab that we have within VA and with Kaiser is critical, so that you don't need to reinvent those partnerships anew. There are a number of us who prefer to spend more of our time trying to be boundary spanners or connectors and trying to bring together collaborations, and for the CTSA to identify those folks and provide some support and encourage them, I think would help to grow this community. Linking up with your regional counterparts, national and international as well. I know there's some pilot funding from the CTSA. Ideally, there would be some form of hard money support in the same way that Kaiser and VA have benefited from the health systems. Easier to say and do in a health system than it is in a university. Although UCLA for a while had funding through the UCLA Institute for Innovation in Health, or some combination of those terms. So there was a commitment by the UCLA health system to support internal innovation. And providing that kind of stable funding, of course, is an attraction to other investigators, as well as support to allow all of us to do better in our grant applications when we have the pilot data and we have the demonstrated commitment from the system. One final thought. Within our Kaiser program, we've often talked about the need to develop a table of our projects, some of which are funded by the health system, some of which are funded through PCORI, NIH, and ARC grants. And the ideal scenario would be a table of projects where reading down the science aims and the practice aims would essentially make the projects indistinguishable as to who funded them. So every practice-funded project should have relatively equal amounts of value and contributions to health system goals and to science goals. Similarly, every project that we bring in, funding from PCORI and NIH and ARC, should contribute relatively equally to health system goals as well as science. So that's the ideal. We've never actually taken the time to try to do this, but in this case, I think the projects that I've mentioned do have roughly equal amounts of contribution to those two sets of goals. And as you can see, the first two were funded by PCORI, the second two, as of now, were funded with system funds, hard money. We hope to turn one into an NIH grant. But I think that's something to aspire to, that the implementation science activity that we conduct that is partnered, embedded in community agencies and health systems would have equal amounts of contribution to these two. So I've moved through these very quickly, and I think I'm a couple of minutes over time, but as they say, I'm here for the rest of the day and happy to talk about this further over lunch or afternoon breaks.
Thanks, Dr. Mittman. Great presentation. I focus on kind of that last slide. Kaiser and kind of the health systems and the health systems research network have been really innovative about kind of partnering the clinical enterprise with the research enterprise, sure. And I like how you laid that out. Do you have any advice for those of us that are embedded in kind of academic medical centers that aren't kind of as vertically integrated, how you might begin developing those kind of partnerships where you're implementing kind of innovations in the health systems that kind of address their goals and also kind of further the research mission? So,
I think the way that we've approached this in VA and in Kaiser probably applies here as well. Kaiser, as I learned when I got there, is not quite the highly systematized, efficient system that I thought. When I entered VA, my impression or perception was VA is an organized system. It does everything in an evidence-based manner and very, tightly controlled. It's not quite the case. There's still a lot of what we call 1950-style medicine within VA. When I got to Kaiser, despite having visited Russ and learning a little bit, I guess I wasn't paying close enough attention, I had the same impression. Kaiser has a mix of clinical departments and domains where care has been studied and optimized. It has a mix of domains and clinical areas where, again, it's, every doc does what he or she wants. So the reason I mention that is that our collaborations with Kaiser physicians in the projects that we pursue that are equally system and science focused are not arbitrary decisions. They're based on inquiries that we receive from colleagues. Obviously in an academic health system, there are likely to be more of those. So I think the short answer is to find those clinicians who are interested in quality improvement, who are interested in seeking support from PCORI, ARC, NIH to further their own goals and take advantage of those, it's sort of jumping on the train to ride it and support it rather than trying to steer it. And I think if we were to develop any sort of top-down list of priorities in Kaiser or VA, we'd be back where we have always been, which is asking for letters of support, knowing that oftentimes they're not even read, let alone indicative of real real commitment and real priorities. But just one last thought, and that is this idea of seeking out, the pockets of innovation and implementation or improvement work may be another way of getting started. And ideally, some of those leaders are placed high enough that they can attract the attention of leaders at the top of the organization, the health system, and make the argument that essentially was made at UCLA to establish the Institute for Innovation. That our system, in order to compete, needs to be a learning health system, always experimenting, always contributing, and there are outside resources available to help meet those system goals. And that's really the way that we pose the argument to our colleagues at Kaiser, not that we want them to help us get tenure or publish.
I had the question for Craig, but I'm going to ask for you and open it for Craig as well. I noticed that the D&I is very much associated with health systems and health research services research at a practice or at a government or is it at a county or so that's very clear. Maybe I need help more with the community-based D&I. I mean, where is it that you can identify this is implementation? When is it one shop that changed, from providing healthy, unhealthy food to healthy food, or is it, one neighborhood of 10 houses? Because why I ask is this is very much different from a health system where you can monitor, you can know, and you can sustain, you can check even after 10 years. While all the others in the community, you don't have the resources to know what happens after 5 years. So is that implementation science?
So yes, it is, and there is as much implementation science underway in health promotion, prevention, community settings. Professor Glasgow is, I think, one of the key people in this room to turn to for some examples and of actual history of that sort of work. Because I've been in VA and Kaiser, it's not work that I do and that I'm familiar with. But I think you're right that the resources that we now have within almost all health systems, the electronic data, a focus on evidence-based medicine, more of an effort to organize care and rationalize and develop, common practices. And much of this is just within the last few years. We don't see the same kinds of trends within community settings, which I suppose you could view as a challenge and an advantage. There's it's more difficult work to do.